Welcome back to Spottable AF, where we don't just talk about the future of work, we bring in the trailblazers shaping it. Today's episode is titled People, Profit and Proof, Redefining HR's Business Impact. And it features none other than Emma Rudd, who is a seasoned HR leader with a passion for transforming people strategies into tangible business outcomes. With over 20 years experience spanning sectors from tech to nonprofits, Emma has consistently demonstrated how strategic initiatives can drive organizational growth and innovation. Emma's approach goes beyond traditional HR practices. She emphasizes the importance of aligning talent management with business objectives, ensuring that every HR initiative contributes directly to the bottom line. Her expertise in organizational development, employment law, and global expansion has made her a sought-after voice in the realm of strategic HR. So, for those of you that don't know, my name's Kate Ball. I am also an international talent strategist, author of the Culture Chronicles, and founder of Sparkle and Sass Consulting. And what you don't know is that I have known Emma both personally and professionally for over 15 years now. We touched base very early in both of our careers when I had a rather unfortunate experience trying to place her in a very high profile business, and it didn't work out. But we're still great friends today. So Emma, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Kate. Great to be here. Thank you for that intro.
Of course. And I'm super excited to have you on board, mainly because, first of all, I've been unapologetic about what this podcast is all about, the theme, the tone that I'm aiming for. I really want us to be straight talking, having the conversations that most people don't, that they're either scared to or just don't feel comfortable having. And I know with somebody like you as a guest that we're on a very similar wavelength on some of these topics, but also recognize the need to have these conversations to help people drive forward, because there's an element of imposter syndrome that goes into why people don't ask questions often. But at the same time, there's also that just disregard and misunderstanding of what's important and why certain things should be happening and aren't. So I really think that you've got such relevant firsthand experience of driving those difficult conversations and some really interesting examples and experiences to share of both what good looks like and what happens when they don't do the right things. So with that in mind, do you want to just give us a brief overview of your career to date and kind of your philosophy of how you approach human resources from a leadership perspective?
Sure thing. So I've been in HR, people leadership, that sort of world for 20 years, as you say, based in the UK, but moving into companies that have scaled up globally. I have worked in the not-for-profit sector as well as the private equity space. And that's really where I found my home. In the last couple of years, it's been scaling tech companies, most recently as the VP of People at Disguise Technologies, a company that specializes in immersive tech in film, broadcast, television. So a really exciting company to work for. And every company has been exciting in its own way, and not least because of its people and the challenge of how you get people to thrive and deliver their best, be their best selves, and really make sure that HR is having an impact in these companies. That's what I sort of live to do. In terms of my keen interest, it probably started around the idea of employment law, but by no means in a compliance sense. Of course, compliance is important, but I think my interest in employment law actually spans into my interest in organizational design and workforce development. What is the future of work, and how can we operate within the parameters that are there to govern us in whatever country we are employing people in? How can we sort of move the needle a bit? How can we influence and change and just do things a little bit differently?
And I know you and I have talked offline many, many times about this subject, but the impact that HR has on a business, the value that is derived by their people team is so frequently underlooked and underappreciated. So, one of the things I really want to dive into talking with you about today, because I really respect how you've done this, not just once or twice, but multiple times, is how a leader, a HR leader, or perhaps somebody that's newer to HR can really communicate that value and the importance of why we do things a certain way, what good looks like, and why it's important to strive for that.
Right. Well, I think the mindset shift needs to be a move away from compliance towards pliability, if you like. So it's not about ticking boxes. It's not about, right, we've just got to make sure that all of these key bases are covered, your performance, development, reporting. Why are we doing these things? Let's bring it back to the why, bring it back to purpose. And I think one of the most important things that HR needs to do differently, if I was really to put it in a nutshell, it is to use data to drive its impact in the business and to tell the story of its impact in the business. I think that's where the failing has been. It's not that HR has not been having an impact, it's the storytelling around the impact. It's been too qualitative rather than quantitative. We needed, and we need to going forwards, have dashboards that are measuring things and tracking as we go to tell that story. So if we think about workforce planning as probably the most obvious area that HR can demonstrate impact in my view. We need to be thinking, are we future proofing this business? Are we going to allow this business to evolve? And particularly in terms of scaling businesses and fledgling businesses, it's about having an eye on the future. A big part of HR's role is to have an eye on what's coming around the corner. I mean, particularly at the moment, we see the dawn of AI. AI needs to be in your organization chart now, and if it's going to be in the org chart, then it's an HR matter, right? And I know, Kate, you had a poll running on LinkedIn this week, and it was, is it an IT concern, a tech concern, a HR and people concern? And I noticed that over 50% of people had said it was an HR concern. And I think that's quite right. And I think this goes back to that challenge for HR. There is nothing that we don't get involved in. We have to be polymaths. And in being polymaths and having an eye on what's coming up around the corner, we need to make sure that we're strongly bonded with all of the teams that we're supporting in any one business. And that will look very different from one company to another. And we role model that sort of polymathic approach to work, where you are bringing a multitude of skills to the table. Not just your specialism, but that you have developed your soft skills, your character skills, if you like, to be someone who is self-aware and thinking about how you as an individual in whatever department you're in are going to be able to add value to this business going forwards.
And I know we've spoken about it and I've brought it up because I personally find it really offensive, I'll be honest, and I apologize if that offends anyone else, but I've seen a spate in recent years of senior leaders in HR having zero HR experience before they take on that role. So people moving from the legal field, from an accounting field, and being appointed head of people. And I think it's inevitable when you have somebody who's come from such a vastly different background that they're going to be driven by and paying attention to very different factors than somebody who has come up through HR as a generalist and is people focused. So how would you advise people who are reporting into non-traditional HR leaders to really help communicate that value and bring it back to kind of that greatest asset, which is the people ultimately?
So I think it's probably best done by going back to those data points. So, in my mind, I often bring it down to sort of 3, 4, 5 buckets, right? And these areas are, people development, people recruitment and talent acquisition, and then around engagement and culture, because these buckets, when sort of pulled together, form the kind of self-actualization of the company. So I'm thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs there. So that idea that an individual, their most important need at the top of that pyramid, and a lot of people will be familiar with that pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That top of the pyramid is about self-actualization. The role of HR, in my mind, is yes, to help individuals to achieve that self-actualization, but also for the company as a group of people, as a system, because a company it's relationships, it's people and how they relate to one another, and HR is responsible for that company actualization. So I would be, yes, mapping back to data and stats on how you are impacting those areas in a way that moves the business forward. So always tying it back to the commercial, the bottom line. I mean, something that I'm never afraid to say is I do not understand why a company would have HR if HR were not contributing to the bottom line. And that's quite a powerful statement to make. It may even ostracize some of my colleagues in HR who are like, what, here to talk about profit? But the cold hard facts are, any business is operating, one of its key drivers, if you like, is to be profitable. Nobody would have a job, right, if it weren't being profitable. But that doesn't mean that sort of company actualization can't be about more than profits. So it's also about the impact that the company is having on the world at large. Think about ESG and CSR. Often founders, particularly going back to the idea of scaling and fledgling businesses, they will have a deep passion for whatever the product or service is that they have created that company to cater towards. And the individuals, again, in whatever field they're in within that company, they want to have that sense of going to work with purpose.
It makes a lot of sense. And first of all, let me just say, I'm not crying. I've got terrible hay fever this morning, so my eyes are watering. So,
yeah.
But talking about how you actually communicate the value, we work in a field in human resources where there's so many different areas you could talk about, like the cost of retention, the cost of attrition, or regretted attrition at least. But it's really difficult to kind of tie down specifics of what has contributed to these things and therefore take ownership of that value. So when you're approaching those conversations with an owner or with a senior leadership team, how are you really kind of quantifying what the value HR is driving?
So there's something called an employee lifetime value figure, or otherwise known as a cost to value ratio. And if you were to depict that on a graph, and as one I came across, designed by a lady called Sarah Lardner at a company called Inecto Rewards Consulting quite recently. And this graph told the story very well, because the x-axis was that sort of growth number in terms of revenue, and the y-axis spoke to the life cycle. So obviously an employee is hired and is onboarded. Then they will have that sort of ramp up period. They will reach a sort of peak of performance and engagement. At some point, that will tail off. And as it tails off, and then into that final period of the life cycle, they may have handed in their notice and they're working out that notice and they're gone. What is the value that you got from that individual during that life cycle? And the best way to tell that story is to calculate a revenue per head. And you can do that across the company as a whole, simply by looking at, okay, what revenue are we achieving on average, and divide that by then the amount of employees you have. But you can start to drill down to a much more granular level and do that per department. And perhaps for your business, you might want to consider what those targets might look like. Where do you expect there to be a higher level of revenue ratio than others? And for example, I mean, sales is probably the easiest example to give, right? But you would expect somebody in a sales team perhaps to be bringing in 5 times their salary in revenue. And that brings me quite neatly onto job descriptions, because job descriptions are something that I often tear my hair out about, because they're something that managers forever say they don't have time to do or think about. Get the lady in HR to do it, all of that stuff that we could cry about sometimes, Kate, when we see it, because it's the most important role you have, is that duty of being a hiring manager. So when you are a manager and a time comes you need to hire, that's probably one of the most important times you're going to stand out as a manager and leader in your business, because you are about to bring in somebody who is going to be adding value to the business. So partner with HR, think about that desired employee value ratio, because there's a lot of cost and investment that's going to go in your time, and the cost of running the vacancy, of covering the vacancy, all of those startup costs. So you're going to want to get a return on this investment. So think about it in those terms. This is a commercial endeavor, as much as it is a sort of people engagement endeavor. So I've lost my thread a bit here.
All right. I know we've talked about, and obviously I run a consulting business now, and I have a number of clients that come to me, and like quite a few I'm working with at the moment on redeveloping their performance management processes. And it amazes me sometimes when I'm having conversations how, and it's not HR and it's not just leaders, it can be all types of people in a business. But I find myself on repeat having to explain to somebody that whether you've got an underperformer that you're replacing or performance improving or whatever, if that person leaves the business, whether they were a high performer or not, even just the act of them leaving gives you about a year of headcount that is not delivering, because you've got that period like you mentioned before they leave. Then you've got the recruitment period where you have no one doing that job. Then you have the ramp up period when you've hired somebody, when they might be doing some of the job, but they're certainly not performing to maximum capability. So all in all, you've got about a year gap. And whether you feel like you've lost a good employee or not, the reality is some effort to help that person overcome, to develop, to recognize what they need saves that year. And so people often look at things like performance development and think it's not worth the effort. They're not good enough. Let's just get rid of them and hire someone better. And it's this really kind of short-sighted mentality, which I'm often having to work to correct, and also really showcase what that cost to the business is that people just don't seem to realize. And that's just one rudimentary example, but it comes up time and time again.
But it's a very good one. It's a very good one about holding the mirror up. And yes, you doing that with numbers is always a way of having an impact. But it's always a difficult conversation to say to somebody, as a manager, where could you have been perhaps articulating the desired impact a little better, which that reminds me, that's where I was going with that job description point, because a job description nowadays ought to be skills focused. We talk about skills based organizations. The reason it needs to be like that is because you should have stats and metrics built in to those behaviors, those desired behaviors and outcomes. So a sales rep might be required to deliver revenue 5 times salary. They might also be required to maintain a customer satisfaction rate of 95% plus across a year. And these are just indicators that you can hold somebody accountable against, and then hold yourself accountable as a manager. What are you going to do to help that person achieve those goals?
Yeah. And this is something like I've literally just written the book on skills-based hiring. So it's something I'm very passionate about myself. And I mean, again, I can't help it. I keep referring back because I love the fact that we've known each other so long and we've both kind of witnessed our career evolutions. But I can't help but go back. God, it's over 15 years now. But shorthand story, I worked in agency recruiting for 10 years. And Emma was somebody I tried to headhunt for a very high profile client who was seeking a head of HR. And little did I know that this client was basically going to implode in a very public way right at the week of Emma's final interview with them. And by this, I mean, this is a household name client. And not only did he get caught having an affair very publicly, but so did his father-in-law, who was the CFO. And they've been running all kinds of things through the business that they shouldn't. And poor Emma is interviewing for their head of HR job in the week. This is all exploded all over the international news platform. And they're basically saying to her, how are you going to fix this? And she's sitting there saying, I haven't even got this job yet.
So I can't, I've been asked some things in my time, but that's up there.
So I love the fact that we're having this conversation because, like I said, I've seen your evolution, you've seen mine. But also, as an aside from that, another job that we put you forward for around the same time, I remember you phoning me after your first interview and saying, take my resume away. I do not want to work for that company. Why would you send me to them? And it was because the owner of the company had told you that you need to know your place. And they had no interest in what you had to input with regards to strategy or direction or culture. He wanted you to be very, very transactional. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I do think, unfortunately, that kind of mentality with regards to the value HR delivers still prevails today in some businesses. And it's really scary to me. But I'd love, obviously, I've segued you in. I'd love you to share your perspective and also how since then you've been able to kind of weed out those businesses and avoid them, but also to drive those conversations and really challenge and educate and influence upwards when that kind of mentality presents.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I particularly earlier in my career, I would either be damned with faint praise or a sort of backhanded compliment that, I could make friends with anyone. When really that could have been phrased as, I have outstanding relationship building skills. Actually really handy for leadership and a career in HR. And I'd also had experiences, like one you mentioned, where various bosses would wonder what HR would have to offer in terms of profit and the commercial agenda, and why would I even be talking about it? Now, I usually found that I could sniff that out pretty quickly at interview, and I'm glad that I was able to make some savvy decisions about just refusing to walk into a place like that. And I've been lucky to say that my sort of chief execs and MDs over the years have been, in the main, very, very good. And they did see a place for HR. But I think even those who did see the place for HR perhaps didn't, truly get beyond it being quite a transactional service provider. And I've had to wrestle with this idea myself. I think I spent a long time early in my career thinking that I needed to maintain the status quo, make sure things were compliant. And then I realized, this is quite an easy road here, Emma, just making sure things are ticking along. I didn't really feel like I was having the impact that I might. And I've really done a lot of thinking, and had coaching myself, which I think is a really important thing to do. Everybody needs a coach. And when I sort of cultivated that self-awareness, I realized that a lot of what was holding me back was my self-talk. And that when I had been brave and I had posited an idea that had been shot down, when I walked away and said, "Oh, Emma, that was silly, and you didn't phrase it properly, and you picked the wrong time," that voice, that inner critic, just needed to go away. And and that's work to realize that you're building a muscle memory either way, whether you're allowing yourself to talk to yourself like that all the time, or whether you're going to challenge yourself to stop yourself talking to yourself like that all the time and actually continue to push on. And there are some fantastic writers around the topic of women, HR, organizational design, and how the workforce has changed. Of course, prolific writers. I mean, yourself included now, Kate Ball. But one who I really admire is a guy called Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist originally. And he talked about the origins of soft skills and how those were found in the US military. So going back to 1951, a guy called Whitmore was asked to design a sort of development program that would build skills within the US military. Now, if those skills did not pertain to munitions and tanks and weaponry, they were labeled soft skills. And however unwittingly, what Whitmore had done was set up this idea that those skills around relationships and communication that were not to do with the hardware of weaponry were in some way inferior, to be second to the primary, when in actual fact those were the very leadership skills that were going to be the most important thing, both for the US military and right the way through business and capitalism worldwide, right? But it's taken decades for HR to fly that flag and get that properly seen and realized by businesses. I now tell that story, that little history nugget, quite regularly when I'm trying to explain to a board why it's important that HR is there to sort of nurture, challenge, and transform a workforce for competitive advantage.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I'm going to have to go and look that up. So thank you for sharing. I geek out about this kind of stuff. So I'm shocked I don't know that. But okay, we're coming up to that 30-minute mark, and I really try and keep these conversations around that because I know a lot of people listen to these on commute. But I'm fascinated. Obviously, we've both had quite an unusual career development trajectory. What advice would you give to the younger you or to the new generation coming up behind you to be able to leapfrog and not make some of the mistakes or not hold back in the ways that you had to? How can they keep driving these conversations forward, starting them earlier, and learn from the benefit of your wisdom?
So I think that fundamental moving away from compliance to making something that is pliant keeps coming up in my mind, because HR has to do things differently because the world is operating differently. Ever since COVID, we have seen such a change in the idea of a workforce and what a workforce is. Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn's book, The Alliance, is one that springs to mind, where the idea of employees needing to do a tour of duty to be given a specific project and with a mission in mind, and to really cultivate quite a fluid workforce is a very important new and novel idea if you are going to truly engage people in your enterprise in the modern world. That also speaks to the gig economy. And I was looking at some stats on this. In the US, 40% of the workforce is now part of the gig economy. In the UK, you're talking about 15%. And if you're going to see that as an opportunity rather than a threat, then HR has to see themselves as a bit of a project manager with a mind on what needs to be delivered this year and across the next 5 in this company. So with that in mind, and the budget and operating costs and what's possible in mind, what is the workforce that we're going to be able to bring in? How can we bring in talent that's going to really speak to this company's aims, not necessarily with a view to even having that employee engaged for longer than that tour of duty, and maybe that's okay. So in this regard, HR are the architects of the modern world of work now, and what that means for human beings. These same people who have realized that their talent is their asset and doesn't necessarily have to belong to one employer. How are we going to see that as an opportunity in HR? And for workforces that are made up of permanent employees, how do you bring that feel, that flavour of opportunity every day being a different day with a different challenge? And it puts me in mind of that idea of T-shaped people. So you will have your specialism, and this certainly tells a story of my own career and harks back to that idea of HR being a role model, right? So you have your I, which is your specialism. So I am a HR professional, but that T, that broad T at the top, breadth of skills, breadth of knowledge, and reading and understanding about the business, about the various departments in the business, making yourself as sort of polymathic as possible, and having that breadth of understanding makes you a far more valuable person to work with, and makes the impact that you are able to have in the world much more impactful also. It's a long-winded answer, but that's your answer.
No, it's a great thought. And one of the things that kept coming up for me as you were explaining as well, and I really just want to kind of hammer home almost, is most business leaders make decisions based on what they've seen and what they've experienced. Mm-hmm. Whereas HR, as you were talking about there, it's almost like you are the predictor of what's coming. So it's about educating that you can't continue to do things the way you've always done them, because here are the risks. Here are the challenges we're going to face, and the importance of being strategic now to prevent those. And really driving a conversation in that way, because if you're not people-minded focused, if you're not out in the world kind of interested in like the gig economy, for example, which Emma and I have discussed, because she knows I'm writing a book on that right now, and really intrigued by. But if you don't understand what's driving these kind of changes, and it's not just COVID and layoffs, it's a lot of different things. But if you don't know that, then as a business leader, you may not be as receptive to the guidance that HR is giving you in terms of strategic changes to make now, or decisions that need to be made sooner rather than later, because you want to be ahead of the curve, not behind it. And so being able to incorporate that storytelling and narrative into the way that you actually interact with and influence senior leaders, I think is going to be really pivotal in the next couple of years, if not just the future in general.
Yeah, that's it, Kate. That makes a lot of sense. One eye on the future, if not both.
Exactly. One foot in the past, both eyes on the future. Hedging your best. All right. I'm going to run us to a close, but very, very last thing, like, what, in your opinion, is one tired, boring, outdated, ridiculous HR phrase, philosophy, or concept that people just need to stop doing? They need to wake up. This has no place in the current or future.
A pet hate of mine that I often see on social media is this thing about HR is not your friend. And it's usually said by people who are being laid off, and I have a lot of sympathy with that, and the feelings that they will have that lead them to saying that. HR absolutely is your friend, because the role of HR is to help you to be your best self at work, to develop, to thrive, to achieve your very best. And I think, yeah, that idea of us being your friend or not your friend, I mean, let's just remove the word friend. HR is a valuable partner, and somebody in an organization. If I were not in HR, I would be making sure that I built a relationship with somebody in HR, because their job is to make sure that you're able to do your best. So why not?
And I'm sorry, is the CFO my best friend? Is
Well, indeed.
software development my friend? Why is it only HR held to this standard of having to be somebody's friend? Ultimately, we're there to do a job, and our job is to advocate for employees. So it's not about being your friend, it's about doing the right thing. And you can't always do the right thing if that company no longer exists because you made poor financial recommendations. There's so many nuances involved with that, but nobody at work is your friend. They're your colleague, they're your employer. So that mentality, I agree, that needs to change. But all right, Emma, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I feel like we could have done at least 3 times the length of this. So I might ask you to come back again in the future. But in the meantime, I really enjoyed the catch up. I really enjoyed talking to you. I know people are going to find it valuable. And you talked about subjects that people are less comfortable driving conversations about. So I think it's been really illuminating and really beneficial for people to see not only what's worked for you, but also some reading materials and recommendations of where to go and continue this learning as well. So I appreciate you.
I appreciate you, Kate Ball. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.